Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to our webinar today for changing jobs as a work permit holder in Sweden. I'm just going to give a few minutes to let people hop on in, and then we will get down to it. As a reminder, if you guys have any questions, um, throughout. You can leave them in the comments and we'll try to kind of answer them if they haven't already been answered in the webinar. If you have very specific cases, then we can't necessarily answer those because those are highly dependent on your history and your background. But we can try to answer general questions, and we will have some resources available for everybody at the end of the webinar. So we'll give it a few more minutes and then we will get started. All right. We will get down to it. If people can't hear me, if you could just let me know in the comments. I've tested everything, but just in case, please do let me know if there are any technical issues. So welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be discussing changing jobs as a work permit holder in Sweden. For reference, this is only going to be related to changing jobs when you're the holder of a work permit. So this wouldn't be around if you have a student permit or if you're here as a dependent or a sambo. This won't cover the same thing because there are different requirements and different opportunities that are available as well. So this is specifically regarding changing jobs as a work permit holder in Sweden. So first things first, in terms of the agenda that we're going to be covering, we're going to go into what do we mean by the first and second 24 months? Because you'll notice in Migrationsverket's page or in terms of kind of the differences in the rules and requirements, they're kind of very clearly split up between the first 24 months and second 24 months. But that can be quite confusing for people. So we'll just do a breakdown of that. We'll go into what constitutes a job change, and then a comparison of the rules and requirements between the first and the second 24 months. Employer obligations, I'm going to go briefly into what your old employer's obligations are, the obligations of your new employer, and then best practices for you and your employer as well to kind of prevent any sort of mistakes from happening that could cause you problems when it comes to your extension. And finally, we will have about 5 minutes for Q&A if anybody has any pressing questions. Those you can put inside of the comments, and then we'll read through them and answer. So first things first, what do we mean when we talk about the first 24 months versus the second 24 months? So essentially, when you're on a work permit, it's split between the first 1 to 24 months on a work permit and having no extensions done, versus when they talk about second 24 months in terms of kind of the changes in rules, it's when you've had a work permit for over 2 years and you've done at least one extension. And the main difference is in the first 24 months, your work permit is tied to your job position and your employer, versus if you've held a work permit for at least 24 months and you've done at least one extension, then your work permit is typically tied to your job position, but not to an employer in particular. Bear in mind, the most important thing is you should always check your decision letter for confirmation in terms of your work permit, because in your decision letter, it will specifically say those kind of rules in terms of you've been hired as an engineer at AB versus you're holding a work permit as an engineer. There are obviously different examples in terms of these days. When you get your first work permit, if you've been issued a probationary period of 6 months, for example, you'll get a work permit for 6 months. And then you'll get your next extension for another 2 years, for example. And then typically the way that it would work is that since you've had an extension, then 18 months into your second work permit at the 24-month overall, then you would be able to then change jobs or change companies without changing job position and just be able to notify the agency. Or you might have one work permit for a year and then you get extended by another year. Then at your next extension, then you would likely have a work permit that's tied to your job position or your profession and not to your company. So when we talk about breaking these two down and when I do my side by side comparison, the first thing is the time of 24 months versus 24 to 48 months, and that an extension has been done at some point as well. So in the first 24 months of a work permit, it's considered a job change if you change job positions, and that includes even internal promotions, which is a mistake that a lot of people tend to make, is that they'll get promoted inside their own company and they think that nothing has to be done. But that's considered a change in jobs. It's considered a change in jobs if you change employers, obviously. If the company you're working at changes their registration number, then it effectively becomes a different employer. So that counts as a job change. If you're given new duties, that constitutes a job change if the conditions of your employment change. And for example, if your company gets absorbed into another company, even if your position doesn't change, then that still counts as having a new employer as well. So all of these constitute a change in jobs. On the other hand, in the second 24 months, so if you've had a work permit for at least 24 months and you've had at least one extension, it's considered a job change if you change job positions, so even internal promotions, if you're given new duties, or if the conditions of your employment change. Now, when we talk about the conditions of your employment, this can even be things like going from, let's say, like 50 to 100%. That scenario is not very likely because you're not going to be issued a work permit for 50% work. But it can be that maybe you change to hybrid, you change to remote. If your salary increases drastically, then even if your job title doesn't change, then all of those can kind of be seen as a flag for Migrationsverket as well. So there's different rules and requirements when it comes to, let me just double check one thing. There's different rules and requirements when it comes to your steps forward once you've actually changed your job. So whether you change your job position, whether you find a new company to work for, the number one question is obviously, do you need to submit a new work permit application? Now, in the first 24 months of a work permit, you must always submit a new work permit application in order to start working. So if you're given a promotion at work, you need to submit a new work permit application. If you change companies, you need to submit. If your company changes registration numbers, you need to submit a new work permit application in order to be able to start working. Whereas in the second 24 months, if you change employers but not your profession, then you should just notify Migrationsverket with your new contract for their kind of approval and for their records. If you change your profession, though, then and company, or you just change your profession, then you need to submit a new work permit application before you start working. So that's the primary difference. There's kind of it's difficult to necessarily find the details that say that you need to submit and notify the agency of your new contract. And if you're in a lot of different Facebook groups, they'll say that you don't have to do that. In general, I'm gonna recommend you should always do that. You should always create a paper trail for yourself as much as possible and submit notification, whether they respond or not, that you've changed job positions. Because I think when it comes to the time for you to apply for extension, the greater paper trail that you can create for yourself, it's obviously ideal. So people will say that you don't have to notify. I always recommend when you have your new contract, you should just notify the agency that you've changed jobs. And then obviously, when it comes time to extension, then your new company will sponsor that permit instead. Let's see, are there any questions so far? Perfect. So In terms of, does the company need to advertise the job position? Now, all of you that have work permits in Sweden know that your company needed to advertise the job position on Arbetsförmedlingen or on the Eures portal to show basically that they gave Swedes and other EU citizens that kind of fair opportunity to find that job and get that job. Now, when it comes to, does the company need to advertise, if you're already in Sweden on a work permit, and you get hired for another company? The answer is, in the first 24 months, yes. The company always needs to advertise the job position before you start working. In the second 24 months, if you're changing profession, the company needs to advertise, even if you're just moving internally. If you're only changing companies, but your profession stays the same, then they don't need to advertise. However, the agency is getting progressively tougher about advertisement. So the general recommendation is to avoid all doubts. Your new employer should just kind of always advertise the position to be on the safe side as well. But the main thing is that the first 24 months, they always have to advertise. It doesn't matter if you're already in Sweden on a work permit. And in the second 24 months, if you're just changing companies but not profession, then according to Migrationsverket, an advertisement does not need to be done. In terms of a question, what does it mean for dependents whose residence permit is tied to the work permit of the parent? Do they keep their residence permit despite the parent changing work permits? We'll go a bit into that, but technically it depends. So if the parent successfully, applies for a new work permit application and they maintain their right to reside in Sweden, then the child or the dependent would obviously they maintain their right to residence. If the main applicant or the work permit holder has their next work permit application denied or their permit revoked or their extension denied, then the dependents would all lose that right. But the way that it works typically is that when you're in your first 24 months, for example, you apply for a new work permit application. That doesn't mean that you get another 2 years. It just means that you'll maintain a valid work permit until kind of the validity of your residence permit ends. And then you would need to apply for an extension. So if you submit a new work permit application like 6 months before your existing permit is set to expire, then you would essentially get a 6-month permit and then you would apply for an extension at the next point. So when it comes to applying for a new work permit application, um, the big difference that that's going to make is if the main applicant, their success in actually maintaining their right to work and right to reside in Sweden. In terms of, can you start working right away in the first 24 months? So first things first, you must submit your new work permit application before you start working. This is a mistake that a lot of people make. They'll start working and then they'll submit the new work permit application. That will absolutely cause you problems later down the line. So you have to submit, and that means that your new company has to initiate the work permit application, the union has to approve, you have to submit your documents and pay for the application before you start working for your new company. You can't do it the other way around. If you do that and you apply while your current permit is still valid, then you can start working while you wait for a decision. Um, if you've held a work permit for more than 6 months, then you can work while you wait for a decision. But if you've actually held a work permit for less than 6 months and you change jobs, you cannot work while you wait for a decision. So that's a really key one that people need to remember is, let's say you get a work permit, you come to Sweden, 4 months into your work permit, you decide that you don't like your employer, you want to change jobs, you find a new employer and you submit a new work permit application. You can't work while you wait for a decision because you've actually been on your work permit for less than 6 months. So it's really important to keep to that deadline. Um, in terms of, I have another question. If you have an EU Blue card and you leave your present job and you don't get a job within the next 3 months, yes, that affects the validity of the EU Blue card. This webinar is specifically about if you're moving from one job to another, not if you have been terminated. We do have another webinar that's on LinkedIn as well about what happens if your position has been terminated or if you've left your job and you don't have the next one. But this one specifically is about if you are changing jobs and you know very clearly the the next job that you're going to. But in terms of for any job change, if you leave a job and then you don't have the next one lined up and you're not able to get one within 3 months, then yes, you technically lose your right to reside in Sweden. Um, for the second 24 months of your work permit, you need to, if you're changing jobs, right? We're talking about what constitutes a job change. You need to submit your new work permit application before you start working. And then for notifying Migrationsverket if you're changing companies but not professions, it's recommended that you submit your new contract before you start working. But it's not quite as mandatory as submitting the work permit application before you start working. And for that one as well, you can work while you wait for a decision. In terms of what documents you need to submit, you actually need to treat the same as your as a work permit extension, essentially. So on top of the standard work permit application paperwork, that would include an offer of employment. Um, your company would initiate it, so they would have kind of the details about the job, the link to the advertisement, and all your documents like passports and things like that. You also need to submit a summary of your pay tax return for every year that you've worked in Sweden, and you can find that on Skatteverket. You need to submit your pay slips for the current year, certificates of employment for all previous employers and positions, which you can get once you've left a company. Certified statements for absence from work, whether that was sick leave or parental leave, you just need to get all of that covered. And then proof of employer insurance coverage. So your employer needs to have the full coverage of occupational injury, life, um, long-term sickness or health, and pension insurance. Those four insurances, they're required to cover that you for the duration of your employment. So it's important that you stay on top of that, that all of your employers have that coverage. Anytime you leave a company, you need to gather that information because you'll have to submit that for the next application. For the second 24 months, if you're not changing professions, then it's good to submit your new contract for Migrationsverket's records. And if you're changing professions, then you need to submit work permit application paperwork, including the things that we just talked about. So all kind of the information from your previous employment as well. Any lapses in kind of compliance from previous employers will also have problems for your future applications. So it's important to stay on top of that. In terms of obligations, there's obviously, as an employer, they have obligations as an employer as well, and they have kind of compliance requirements that they're supposed to actually meet. So I'll go briefly into the old employer's obligations, so kind of your previous employer's obligations, and then your future employer's obligations as well. So the old employer's obligations is to issue you a certificate of employment. So you can ask for this upon exiting the company, or in the lead up, they can set that date as well to kind of show the dates that you worked for them, the scope of your work, and that sort of thing. They need to have had all the required insurances for the duration of your employment. So, like we discussed, occupational injury, life, health, and pension. And then they are actually required to hold on to all of your immigration documentation, including a copy of your residence card for 12 months after your employment ends. Um, it's important then when you're kind of leaving an employer just to make sure that you have everything sorted in terms of your final payments, holiday pay, that you have all of your pay slips. And I just recommend tracking the pay slips on a monthly basis and having them kind of set into folders so you have them year by year. And just making sure that everything is above board. But the old employer's obligations is especially the issue of certificate of employment, which can't be withheld. And then you need to get the service provider and the premium number for all of your insurances that you had as well. When it comes to your new employer's obligations, so the company that you're going to be going over to, one of the important things is that they need to validate your right to work before hiring you. That is their obligation as an employer of they need to check your right to work and they need to hold on to the documentation that proves your right to work as well. In Sweden, ignorance is not seen as a valid excuse for when there are mistakes made, which means that if they hire you, maybe not legally, or there's some sort of lapse, or they weren't supposed to be hiring you, or they've made a mistake. That's not seen as a reason for Migrationsverket or the government to show leniency. So it's really important, just in case the agency checks, they need to validate your right to work before hiring you, including checking your immigration documents and or residence card. And they actually need to hold on to a copy of your residence card um, if they if you don't have your residence card, then they can just take a copy of your decision letters as well. They need to have advertised the job correctly on Arbetsförmedlingen. In terms of that, when it comes to the advertisements, some employers will be quite vague with their advertisement just to kind of make it as a cut and paste, to make it as easy as possible. If there's too big of a discrepancy between the advertisement and then the offer of employment, then they actually won't count that as valid. So it's very important that the job is advertised in Arbetsförmedlingen for at least 10 business days before you sign any sort of contract, that the job title on the advertisement matches the offer of employment, and that all the details and the job requirements and kind of the duties all match up with the offer of employment as well. So it's very important that there's a good correlation between the two, at least for 10 days before you sign the contract, and then you can start the work permit application. They obviously need to offer a contract that meets Swedish standards or is not worse than what has been set by the unions for that specific profession and the SSYK code. When a work permit is initiated, the company will actually first input the terms of employment, and then that gets sent to the relevant union. Typically, if the company doesn't have a collective agreement, then the union will just basically like defer or not have an opinion about whether the terms meet Swedish standards, which means it's up to the Migrationsverket case officer in order to make that assessment. One thing is that your new salary should never be lower than your old salary, if you're staying in the same profession. So you're not really supposed to go backwards in terms of salary, regardless of kind of the size of company that you're going into. It needs to meet the national standards. Currently, it's over 28,000 SEK per month as kind of the salary threshold. And it also needs to be at least above the 10th percentile of that salary's SSYK code. So your employer needs to check all those things, especially if they don't have a collective agreement. But even with a collective agreement, they need to check that so that that's not the reason that a work permit application is denied. And then they need to purchase all required insurances for the duration of the employment. In terms of insurances, you don't necessarily need to have the full packet and the coverage or like a certificate, but what you should have is the policy numbers and the providers as well. And then they'll also ask for the date from when it was valid until when it's valid. So those are important things to know. If you can get a certificate, obviously it's easier and it's, insurance for you. But the main thing is just knowing the provider and the premium number as well. And then in terms of best practices, for you, you should always check your decision letter whenever you get a decision letter to know what you can and what you cannot do. And that also includes then information about your family members or whether you can change jobs or whatever you can do. Um, you always need to check your own decision letter so that you have the best understanding of what your ability to do is. You should also keep track of your necessary paperwork and your own personal obligations as well, in terms of making sure that all the taxes are paid, having a pay tax return done every year. You need to check your right to work or change jobs before you actually do so. So let's say, like we talked about before, about the changing jobs less than 6 months into your work permit, and then you start working right away. That's going to create problems for you in the future. And if you say, oh, I didn't know that I couldn't do that, the agency is not going to see that as an excuse. So you actually have to check your own right to work and your ability to change jobs and the processes before you actually do so. Importantly, you should always confirm your new employer's willingness to actually sponsor your next extension before you change jobs. A company might, let's say, especially in like the second 24 months when they can just hire you and then you just have to send in a new contract, is they might be like, oh, that was super easy, wonderful, we don't actually have to do anything. And then it comes time for your extension where they still are responsible for initiating your work permit application. And then they might be like, oh no, actually we're not interested in that. And then you've left another job and you changed, and it's a difficult climate right now and it's high unemployment and all these sorts of things happening, and there's kind of no recourse for it. There's companies not obligated to sponsor a work permit. It's not actually kind of written into law in that sense. So it's really important before you actually, obviously nobody can commit to things 100% because it also depends on how you fit with the company, how your performance is, how you like them, and all of those things. But you really need to check their willingness to sponsor and support your next extension before you actually change to a different company. And then finally, check your salary before you change jobs. Um, because let's say you go from one company, and let's say you're an engineer and you're making 30,000 SEK. You go to another company and you have the same title of engineer. And then for the sake of like keeping things as easy as possible, the company kind of keeps you as an engineer, but they're suddenly paying you 50,000 crowns. That massive discrepancy between the two could end up raising a lot of flags with Migrationsverket. And then they're going to say those don't actually look like they're the same profession, and that can cause you problems. So it's really important to like be honest, and it's obviously important like when you change jobs, you can have that salary raise, but you do need to to make sure that kind of your progression from one company to another isn't so outrageously kind of big that it raises red flags with the agency. With regards to, yes, I have a question about, so your dependent spouse can work on a valid visa. If they get a job and the main applicant loses a job, what can be done in such a situation? Can the dependent visa of the spouse be converted to a work permit? It cannot be converted from inside of Sweden. So a dependent, if they want to become the main applicant, then they can apply for a work permit, but they'll actually need to leave Sweden while they wait for a decision. The main applicant who's moving to a dependent can wait in Sweden as long as their permit is valid, and then they can convert from a main applicant to a dependent permit from inside Sweden, but a dependent can never go to a main applicant from inside Sweden. So that is something to consider as well. In certain industries, obviously, work permit applications can go much more quickly. In other industries, they can go much more slowly. And especially when it comes to them, kind of those sort of changes, there's a lot more due diligence and paperwork checking that Migrationsverket would have to do, which means that the process will take longer. So you need to take that into account into how long you're kind of willing to leave the country, as well as how long the the dependent's employer is like, can they work remote? Does that work for them? Are they going to lose their job if they have to leave the country? Because Migrationsverket will reach out and say, okay, you need to leave the country so we can make a decision. Um, Salary difference doesn't really matter when you change company and profession. Um, as long as the advertisement was done correctly and all of those things, and kind of the process was done correctly with regards to submitting a new work permit application, then it's not a problem. The main challenges come from when you're changing in the second 24 months, if you're changing profession, but if you're changing companies, but you're not changing profession, and your new company keeps the same job title to make things easier, but then they clearly have offered you like upper management duties, or the salary is a lot more reflective of a much higher position, then Migrationsverket will likely flag that as well. Um, let's see. Those were the main things that we wanted to cover today. We've made kind of, I think it's a 4 or 5 page PDF that does the side-by-side comparisons of the kind of two different options and what the rules and requirements are. So we will put that into the comments. I'll try to answer kind of everybody's questions inside the comments as well. I know we talked about it verbally, but just so that we have things in writing, and please continue to kind of feel free to ask questions inside of the comments. We will also be launching soon a software for individuals so that you can kind of have a better understanding of whether you can change jobs, which permit types can you switch from and to, document uploading, if you're an employee, so that you can actually kind of like track your own documents and understand what things you need to do. So I will put a link for people that would like to sign up for the wait list if you'd like to be informed when we launch that site as well. Please feel free to follow me. I will take my face out so you can see my name is Sai Rose Weatherford, and I am one of the co-founders of Emigrate. Perfect. If nobody has any more questions, that was the main things we were going to cover today. So thank you so much for joining us. And make sure to follow us on LinkedIn. We are Emigrate. We are based in Sweden. So the main thing we kind of cover are Swedish work permits and other immigration processes. And if you have any topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars or content that we create, then you can send me a DM, or you can put in the comments of this webinar as well. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.